Adolf Hitler. Here is something that most people get wrong about Adolf Hitler. He didn't kick the door open and grab power like in the movies. There was no dramatic takeover. No one busted into parliament shouting orders. Instead, power was handed to him slowly, almost politely, by people who were convinced they were the smart ones in the room. On November 6, 1932, things weren't exactly looking great for Hitler. His party, the Nazis, had just lost about 2 million votes. Money was drying up. Momentum was slipping. And the key part in all of this? He had never won a majority in a free election. Meanwhile, Germany itself was a mess. The economy was shaky. Politics felt like a quarrel with no referee. Leaders were desperate for stability. The president at the time, Paul von Hindenburg, didn't even like Hitler. Behind closed doors, he called him that Bohemian corporal. Not exactly a compliment. Surrounding Hindenburg was a circle of advisors who thought they had a clever plan. One of them, Franz von Papen, basically said, "Relax, we can use this guy." He even told a colleague, "We've hired him." Imagine thinking you have hired someone who is about to change your entire country. On January 30th, 1933, Hitler was appointed chancellor, not elected into full control, appointed. And even then, his party only held 3 out of 12 cabinet positions. On paper, it looked like he was surrounded and limited. But then, something happened. The Reichstag building went up in flames. A fire tore through Germany's parliament. To this day, people still argue about who started it. Within hours, everything changed. Hindenburg signed an emergency decree suspending freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, freedom of the press, and the right to a fair trial. Fear spread fast. Overnight, Germany shifted. By sunrise, thousands of people had been arrested. And it didn't stop there. 7 weeks later, the same parliament that was supposed to keep power in check voted to give all legislative authority to Hitler's cabinet for the next 4 years. Then, it kept getting renewed until it didn't matter anymore. And the people who made that decision, they were still convinced they were in control. But every single one of them was wrong. Saddam Hussein. On July 22, 1979, just 6 days after Saddam Hussein officially became president of Iraq, hundreds of senior Ba'ath Party officials walked into Al-Qult Hall in Baghdad for what they believed was a routine leadership meeting. Doors were closed behind them. Everything felt like a normal day. But it was anything but. Saddam stepped up to the podium. He was calm at first, then suddenly became emotional. Some people said he looked like he was about to cry when he told the room a conspiracy had been uncovered. Some people plotted against his government. One of those accused was Muhi Abdul Hussein Mashhadi, a former high-ranking party member. He had already been arrested and tortured. Now, he stood in front of everyone, forced to confess. Then, he began reading the names of 68 alleged co-conspirators. Each time a name was called, guards would walk in and take that person away. No explanations, no return, just gone. You can imagine the room. Some people started chanting, "Long live Saddam," trying to prove their loyalty. Others sat frozen. Some were shaking. Some were crying. Nobody said it out loud, but everyone understood what was happening. Then came the final twist. Saddam announced that those taken away would be executed, and the people in that room would carry it out themselves. Think about that for a second. You're not just watching, you're being forced to participate. To prove your loyalty, you have to turn against your own colleagues. At that moment, every senior official in the Ba'ath Party became complicit. No one could later claim innocence because the entire event was filmed, and the footage was distributed across Iraq as a warning. By the end, Saddam had eliminated dozens of perceived rivals and officials, and the message was clear. Power had changed hands. Vladimir Putin. In August of 1999, a former KGB officer named Vladimir Putin was appointed Prime Minister of Russia by Boris Yeltsin. At the time, he was polling around 2%, and most Russians barely knew his name. Yeltsin's team wanted a successor who would protect them once he stepped down from office. Putin had already shown loyalty during corruption investigations tied to that era. To them, he looked reliable, even controllable. And then, everything changed. In September of 1999, a series of apartment bombings hit Russia. 4 buildings were destroyed, and nearly 300 people were killed. The attacks were blamed on Chechen militants, and Putin responded fast. He launched a military campaign in Chechnya, promising to hunt down those responsible. and the country rallied behind him. Within weeks, his approval ratings jumped from obscurity to around 30%. Then, they surged past 70% as the war escalated. But one incident raised questions. On September 22nd, residents in Ryazan spotted men carrying sacks into a basement. Police tested the contents. It came back positive for hexogen, the same explosive used in the earlier bombings. The building was evacuated. The next day, authorities later said it was a training exercise. Critics and some investigators have argued that it may not have been that simple. 3 months later, on December 31st, Yeltsin resigned on live television and handed over power to Putin. Within hours, Putin signed a decree granting Yeltsin immunity. He never really gave that power back. As of 2026, Putin remains in control. Several journalists who investigated the bombings died under unclear circumstances. Joseph Stalin. In 1922, everyone in the Soviet Communist Party wanted to be a commissar. They wanted to lead armies, give powerful speeches, and write ideas that would last for generations. Nobody wanted the boring jobs. You know, the ones with paperwork, schedules, and membership lists. But that was exactly the job Joseph Stalin chose. He became general secretary. At the time, it looked small and administrative, nothing flashy. But here is where it gets interesting. If you're managing membership records, you decide who gets in. If you schedule meetings, you decide who speaks and who stays quiet. And if you assign people to positions, you slowly fill every important role with people who owe you. So while others were chasing attention, Stalin was building control. By the time Vladimir Lenin died in 1924, Stalin had loyalists everywhere, in every committee, every regional organization, and every significant party body in the Soviet Union. And Lenin actually saw this coming. In his final months, he dictated a document now called Lenin's Testament. In it, he warned that Stalin had too much power and should be removed. But here is the twist. The warning was read to party leaders, but never widely shared with the public. Joseph Stalin took the job nobody wanted, and then he made sure everything went through him. Pol Pot. Nobody in Phnom Penh knew his real name. He had been hiding in the jungle for 12 years, running a communist insurgency under the alias Brother Number 1. Even most of his own fighters didn't know who he actually was. His real name was Salat Tsar. He had studied in Paris in the 1950s, joined a communist group, and returned to Cambodia with a vision to restart civilization from scratch. He wanted a society with no cities, no money, and no educated class. He spent years building the Communist Party of Kampuchea, better known as the Khmer Rouge. Then, he disappeared into the jungle and waited. And while he waited, something else was happening. Between 1969 and 1973, the United States carried out heavy bombing campaigns in Cambodia. The goal was to hit enemy supply routes, but the impact spread far beyond that. Villages were destroyed, civilians were killed, and anger grew, especially in rural areas. That anger became fuel, and in 1970, Pol Pot had approximately 10,000 fighters with him, and by 1975, he had grown to about 70,000. On April 17, 1975, his forces marched into Phnom Penh, the capital of Cambodia, and took control. Within hours, they ordered the entire city to leave. Around 2 million people, including hospital patients, were forced out of the capital at gunpoint. He had waited 12 years in a jungle while somebody else's bombs helped the Khmer Rouge grow fast. Then, in one move, he took the country. Benito Mussolini. When people talk about the March on Rome, they picture Benito Mussolini leading thousands of blackshirts, boldly seizing power by force. It sounds intense, almost cinematic, but that version of the story wasn't what actually happened. Let's rewind. In October of 1922, Mussolini organized about 30,000 blackshirts to move towards Rome from different directions. But here is what you're not usually told. Many of them were poorly armed, and some had no weapons at all. The Italian army could have stopped them in a single afternoon. Prime Minister Facta knew this and declared martial law, which would have ordered the army to do exactly that. All he needed was one signature from King Victor Emmanuel III. The king first approved it, then backed out at the last moment when it mattered. Without that approval, the army stood down, and everything shifted in that moment. Mussolini, who had been waiting in a hotel in Milan with a packed bag, ready to flee to Switzerland if things went wrong, received a telegram from the palace. The king wanted him to form a government. Mussolini boarded the overnight train to Rome, arrived in the morning, and was appointed prime minister. The black shirts then marched through Rome in a victory parade, after the appointment, not before it.